Hey everyone, welcome. I'm going to let folks jump in here. We've got people joining from our well-appointed Zoom waiting room. I hope you enjoy the refreshments in the waiting room. We'll get started in just a moment.
How
All right, so let's see where we are with our, I think everyone has been able to jump into the session. So with that, I'm going to kick us off. I want to welcome Jacob Helberg, who's got a terrific book out, somewhat hot off the presses still, a few weeks now, Wires of War. Jacob is a senior advisor at the Stanford Program on Geopolitics, Technology, and Governance, the program that I founded and lead here at Stanford. He's an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the co-chair of the Brookings Institution China Strategy Initiative. From 2016 until 2020, Jacob led Google's internal global product policy efforts to combat disinformation and foreign interference, including policy and enforcement processes against state-backed foreign interference, misinformation, and actors undermining election integrity. He studied international affairs at the George Washington University and received his Master's of Science in Cyber Risk and Strategy from NYU. Welcome, Jacob. It's great to have you. Let's jump in. So it's a terrific book. I enjoyed reading it. It's part personal history, your journey as a professional at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and governance. Part history of the internet and the ecosystem of digital technologies that's sprouted up around it, and also perhaps most importantly, a call to action for democracies to step up as this technology introduces new risks for democracies, new opportunities for authoritarian regimes to undermine democracy. I want to start by reading a passage from the book. So it goes like this: a note on terminology. Despite growing evidence of malign activities, China, Russia, Iran, other countries, some scholars and policymakers continue to debate whether this conflict in fact constitutes a new Cold War. To me, Jacob Helberg, the question is not whether we are reliving the Cold War, but whether we are living through a Cold War, lowercase c, lowercase w, Cold War. The term has a history. George Orwell helped define it, calling it a prolonged peace that is no peace. What is a gray war?
So a gray war basically refers to when geopolitical great powers, competitors, engage in direct geopolitical conflict through the gray zone. The gray zone being just below the conventional threshold of war. What we've seen over the last few years is this has increasingly become a predominant feature of international politics because dual-use technologies have seeped into every area of our lives. So it's made it more possible than ever to attack, for governments to attack one another, undermine each other, compete, and engage in conflict through the gray zone.
And what is for our audience, just what is a dual-use technology?
A dual-use technology is a commercial civilian technology developed, typically by private companies for commercial civilian purposes, that where the underlying technology itself can potentially be used for strategic applications, meaning for military applications. So this would include things, the spectrum of different technologies ranging from low orbit satellites that can be used for farming purposes or to detect missile silos in Chinese deserts. It can include things like advanced AI systems, as well as biomedical technologies.
And so, tell us a little bit about why did you write? What prompted you to write this book? Why now?
Well, as I was working at Google, I worked on a few different projects. My work started focusing on foreign interference and helping the company develop its internal architecture, policy architecture for how it approached and dealt with the new emerging issue that was governments starting to use content platforms, American and Western-based content platforms, to undermine each other, to discredit one another, to engage in fundamentally, information warfare. And that, soon we started to see a lot of other trends pop up on the horizon. Obviously, I briefly advised on Project Dragonfly, which was, a whole can of worms in and of itself. It eventually ended up leaking to the press. I had
what is Project Dragonfly?
Project Dragonfly was an effort to basically reintroduce Google search into China. It was very well intentioned. It matched up on paper. It matched up very well to Google's mission, which is making the world's information universally accessible and useful. Obviously, fulfilling that mission well. One could make a reasonable argument that having a presence in the world's largest internet market would make a lot of sense. I had reservations because at the end of the day, I think that rationale overlooked a lot of complicated and fast-moving geopolitical dynamics. I obviously am of the school of thought that the Chinese system and the American system have some irreconcilable differences that I kind of saw play out in the corporate sector and across the tech industry, really. I mean, these things were not unique to Google. There were, the tech industry as a whole was finding itself caught in the crosshairs. And so as I started to think about going through the motions of the intellectual exercise of thinking through, okay, so, tech companies have, for the most part, kind of addressed the burning crisis of the day. We've turned a corner. How should we think more proactively about, what the 24-month time horizon looks like in terms of where things are going? And it became clear to me that fundamentally the issues on the table for tech were the fact that increasingly governments were treating tech as tools and targets of geopolitical competition. And that was fundamentally what was causing a lot of, the friction that was coming up. And so to me, it just seemed like these were issues that transcended a single company. It really was about issues that were much bigger than Google. It touched upon topics that were core to American national security. And so I decided to write a book about it because the information is obviously entirely based on publicly available information that is about the security in the future, the security of the country and the future of democracy. And the aim for the book is to help encourage a public policy debate based on a topic that I felt was being under discussed in, the national security foreign policy community at the time.
So, someone who spent many years in Washington, D.C. before coming to the farm 4 years ago now, I'm struck by this continued debate among both policymakers in Washington, and not just Washington, but Brussels, other major capitals, about how to engage Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley as a metaphor for tech effectively. And, it's a debate that, that we've been having now for many, many, many years. I observe that, in Silicon Valley, that is not a very, top level topic of debate, certainly not like it is in Washington, D.C. So right there's an obvious sort of, mismatch in terms of interest in collaboration. Silicon Valley got its start, right? Silicon, right, is part of the name of the region. And that industry, cropped up in no significant, no insignificant part because of government support. I'm wondering what has changed, in the past 20 years in Silicon Valley to make this divide between Silicon Valley and Washington and Brussels and elsewhere so sharp. And what do you see as part of the solution set? Can that divide be bridged? I frankly am skeptical, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, hope springs eternal, and as an optimist, I certainly hope that it can be. In the book, I bring up an example of how in the years leading up to World War II, General Motors had embraced, General Motors, and along with the other major automakers that was one of the companies participating in the rearmament effort, and had embraced the slogan, "Victory is our business." And that slogan, in a lot of ways, embodied a mindset that was fundamentally unambiguously signaled that corporate America at the time, and at the time the auto industries were kind of, among America's largest tech companies, unambiguously embraced the idea that these were American companies that were going to support the rearmament effort, support the national security apparatus to fight the Germans and the Japanese. Today, you have a very different mindset and playing field. We have gone through many years in the tech industry where there was a very influential school of thought that basically proned the idea that tech companies had grown so big and so global and so complex that they should kind of operate as quasi-sovereigns. A number of tech companies were starting to hire effectively their own foreign policy team to engage with governments directly on a one-on-one basis around the world. Some companies have been championing international treaties on AI non-proliferation. So we've seen over the years companies start to develop the habit of operating almost somewhat independently of the U.S. foreign policy and national security apparatus. And I think that was partly because companies had sort of started taking for granted the fact that from the vantage point of a tech company, the world feels very global because the internet is primarily open and free. So for them, they think about we have a billion users, 150 million of them are in the US, but we have all these other users around the world. But I think fundamentally what has missed from the equation is the fact that, these companies have a lot of users abroad and, are global in that sense. But the only reasons that they're global the way that it is because we have an open and free internet that is the direct fruit of American foreign policy. And so I think that there's been a bit of a disconnect over the years that's formed in tech companies not totally losing sight of how American foreign policy has benefited them and why American foreign policy continues now more than ever to be important to the future viability of a lot of American tech companies and a lot of their business, whether it's on IP, whether it's the ability to operate internationally, or on a number of other important fronts.
Yeah, and China is a fascinating kind of case study of this dynamic where it was American foreign policy coupled with an interest on the Chinese side to open up more of the Chinese economy to international trade and investment and vice versa, which helped create this market for significant parts of the U.S. tech industry, and obviously industries be well beyond tech industry. And obviously now we're that relationship has shifted into a phase that I would characterize as having lots of entropy. Clearly the view in Washington that had prevailed for a generation or two, of foreign policy hands and scholars, that China's market would liberalize, And as that occurred, the political system would liberalize, and China would come to be take on a greater interest in sort of upholding sort of the global status quo as opposed to challenging it. That view is obviously proven to be incorrect, and now we see a debate underway around, okay, so what is the next paradigm? I personally resist the urge to try to reduce a relationship as complex as the U.S.-China relationship to a bumper sticker. I don't think you can do that. But nevertheless, there's a search for a new paradigm. When I first got out to Silicon Valley, my family and I first moved out here to come to Stanford 4 years ago. I played this parlor game where I would ask people, in Silicon Valley to kind of free associate words with China, and you'd get responses like market, investor, business partner. You did the same exercise in Washington, D.C., and you'd get a very different set of answers. I'm curious, from your vantage point, my sense is that here in Silicon Valley, that there's now a realization that Washington has a new view of China, but that it's not necessarily internalized here in tech. I'm curious your thoughts on this. I mean, where again, we're painting with broad brushstrokes, right? Tech is not monolithic. I don't want to, but we're going to do it anyway.
Totally.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that I agree with you. I think there has been a slow realization in tech that things in Washington have changed significantly. You see that in congressional hearings. The kind of language that a lot of tech execs are using has evolved. But I think in tech, a lot of people realize also that things in China have also changed a lot in recent years. Long are the days of when people had hopes that China was going to liberalize, and just to dial back to some of to one of the initial points that you made about, initially we hoped that as China would grow richer, they'd become freer. I think, fundamentally, when we ask ourselves really big consequential questions of how do we define the current geopolitical struggle that we're in, I think it's so important to catalog, what we got right and what we got wrong over the years. Back in the day, as you point out, the school of thought was, we don't have to worry about liberalizing China proactively because they're going to grow richer, and as they grow richer, they're going to become freer. Then the paradigm shifted to peaceful coexistence. Okay, so they're not totally becoming freer, but certainly there's a world where we can coexist peacefully and somehow have this balancing act.
They're bought into the status quo, in effect.
Yeah, they're bought into the status quo, that they benefit the international, that they benefit from the international system and therefore won't want to revise it. And now, it's really hard to continue making that case when you see language that's coming out of Beijing that's very much geared at dominating tech, dominating politically when they want to export extraterritorially a lot of their censorship laws. And so I think it's important to kind of look at that fairly and reasonably and say, okay, we have, over the years really assumed these very rosy scenarios with China that have all been wrong. So clearly there's something here that we're missing, and we should revisit a little bit and broaden the aperture of the different scenarios that we're factoring in under consideration. I'm obviously of the view that, I talk about it as a gray war because I think one of the predominant central features is that it's ambiguous. It's in the gray zone. It's hard to put your finger on it. Sometimes attacks are hard to attribute. And these are fundamentally becoming cross-cutting attributes of the day-to-day international politics. And in a way that's, why it's left us in a difficult position to respond is the gray zone nature of it. But I do think that at the end of the day, it's important that we do call it a war and not a competition, because a competition implies that you're competing on a level playing field along mutually agreed upon rules. And at the end of the day, you can afford to lose a competition. In a war, you understand that you're dealing with an adversary where the outcome is the viability and survival of your political system. in a war, you accept making short-term sacrifices in order, towards the bigger, broader mission of being successful in the war. And also you have clarity that in a war, your only overriding objective is to win the war. You're not going to do welfare reform in the middle of World War II because the priority is defeating Germany and Japan. And so that's, I think that is the kind of laser focused approach and clarity and strategic clarity that is needed to take on this very formidable geopolitical challenge that has emerged over the last few years.
Yeah, I personally, I struggle with this. I don't love the phrase war. I spent, most of my career as kind of
it's a loaded word. I get it.
Well, no, it is a loaded word, literally and figuratively, and it's kind of a knuckle dragging, national security guy. And, but, I took your point about competition, right? It's, competition sounds friendly, right? And there's,
we compete with Germany and Japan.
Yeah.
We're not, but I think, the way that I think about it is that there's basically three building blocks of issues at work in our relationship with China. There's the fact that they're a rising power. There's the fact that they're an autocracy. And then there's the, unfair commercial trade dynamics. And I think that my, assessment of that whole situation is the fact that I think that actually most Americans would probably be totally fine with, I think most Americans would be fine with the fact that they're a rising power. And I think Americans would probably give them a pass on unfair trade dynamics if they were a democracy. But I think at the end of the day, what kind of is the straw that breaks the camel's back is the fact that in addition to unfair trade practices commercially, in addition to the fact that, they're on a path to potentially becoming number one, which is, scary to some people, is that the vision for the world that they're bringing to bear is an autocratic vision that's antithetical to everything that we stand for. And so I think that it's that third piece, the autocracy piece, I think is what has been so galvanizing among the public.
Yeah, I think that's right. So let's talk a little bit more about this concept of gray war. You describe in the book that this is occurring on two fronts. Why don't you describe for us what those two fronts are?
Yeah, so there's the front end of the war, which is basically the software layer of the internet. That refers to basically the information that people see on a day-to-day basis on the surface of their screens. Internet users have probably come into interaction with the front end of the war through, information operations that the Russians did in 2016, information operations that Saudi Arabia, Iran, and obviously most recently China have engaged in during the pandemic. And then there's the back end of the war, which is the hardware layer of the internet. So you have software and you have hardware. At the hardware level, you really have two players. You have the US and China, because those are the only two countries that harbor companies that have the engineering wherewithal to be competitive in that space. And at the end of the day, as I describe in the book, I think that the hardware back-end battle of the gray war is going to be the decisive one, because if you can control and compromise the internet, the internet at the hardware level, you can compromise everything that runs on top of that. So, software and everything in between. And so I think it's so important for the US to secure its physical internet infrastructure, because if the physical guts of the internet aren't secured, nothing that runs on top of it is secured. And as I read in the book, I think fundamentally that creates a new paradigm, of national sovereignty, because when you control the wires in the ground, you no longer have to send troops on the ground. And because if you imagine a world where China controls the internet infrastructure in an African country, for example, and all of a sudden it knows all the most intimate secrets and the sexual escapades, the financial dealings, the private communications of all the judges, the journalists, and the politicians in that country, you can effectively turn that country into a satellite state. And so that's why the back end battle of this gray war is fundamentally redefining our old conceptions of national sovereignty.
So let's turn now to what do we do about it? You spend it's one of the things I appreciate about the book is it's not just a diagnosis of a problem. You put a lot of thought into the solution set, and I do want to mention to our attendees that we welcome your questions. What we plan to leave pretty substantial time at the end for you all to jump in. So you'll see on the bottom of the Zoom screen the Q&A tab. Go ahead and tap that and put a question in the queue. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. So in terms of recommendations, spending some time on China for a moment specifically, I hate the phrase decoupling. I don't think it means anything. I prefer, and so from my perspective, what we're sort of gesturing at when we talk in the U.S. and frankly in the Chinese foreign policy establishments about this idea is what we really mean is sort of changing the terms of interdependence to favor democracies or not. What's your take on decoupling? After I've just trashed the concept.
Yeah. Well, so China has published a lot of initiatives that are geared at that are aimed at reducing China's reliance and dependence on Western markets. And so I think it's important for us when we think about, at the risk of using the unsavory term decoupling, I think it's important for us to think about, essentially if they're decoupling from us, we're not really going to be talking about being coupled, we're going to be talking about being dependent. And so, that's not to say that we should try to have a world where every country lives in a fortress and don't trade with each other, but we should think about, as I write in the book, I think the national security and there's going to be a lot of legwork that's going to have to be done collaboratively between the government and industry to figure out what are the bucket of goods that are so sensitive to national security that they're going to have to be made here in the United States. What are the goods that can be made in an allied space that are important, but that can be made in an allied space? And what are the classes of goods that are not sensitive at all to national security, and we don't really care where it comes from? And so I think going through the motions of figuring out how do we classify the universe of those different types of goods is an exercise that our government is going to have to run through, and obviously going to have to consult quite a bit with industry.
Yeah, I note yesterday the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is the U.S. government agency that administers export controls, issued a request for comment on brain interface technologies, which if you had shown me that RFC 20 years ago, I'd have thought it was pulled straight from a sci-fi comic book. But here we are. And BIS is asking in that, it's just one example, right? Is this the type of technology that presents the types of national security risks that merit or require the government to manage international flows of it. Semiconductors is an area that is one technology that there's been a lot of debate in Washington. There's legislation on the Hill to invest some $50 billion in U.S. semiconductor supply chain resilience. That bill is out of the Senate. It's waiting action in the House. There's a lot of activity around export controls. A big part of the administration's strategy is to deny China access to some of the high, the cutting edge design technology, there is a risk, of course, that we go too far. And coming back to this question of how Washington and Silicon Valley, again using Silicon Valley as a metaphor for tech, interact. As someone who's followed this relationship closely, what are the pain points in terms of getting industry to engage, productively and constructively in these debates? Because ultimately the government's goal, right, potentially is to impose controls, which is to say regulate, and all things equal, businesses prefer not to be regulated.
Right.
So how do we crack that?
So my starting point is the fact that it's in the preamble of our Constitution that it's a fundamental purpose of the U.S. government is to provide for the common defense. The intellectual philosophy that I bring to that question is basically premised on the idea that government and industry have different rules and responsibilities. The government's job is to do national security, among other things, but national security is core to the government's purpose. National security is not the job of tech companies. Their job is to build products people love and deliver value for shareholders. And so I think that part of what needs to happen is for the government to basically be very unambiguous and clear in communicating what the ground rules should be for industry and setting the North Star and basically telling industry, look, here's the deal. Here's where things are headed. Here are the priorities that we need to, and the milestones that we need to hit as a country. The government would like to work with you collaboratively to get there. And basically there might be areas where private industry will need government support to do certain things. Like, for example, reshoring certain sensitive supply chains is super capital intensive. It requires a lot of different resources, both in terms of specialized human talent, raw material resources, a lot of brick and mortar infrastructure. And so that might be an area where, if we want to do things quickly, it might be an area where the government can help provide resources to do that. But the government is also going to have to basically lay down ground rules to basically say, we're not going to allow private industry to invest in China in areas that are sensitive to national security. For example, we're not going to allow American pension fund money to be invested in Chinese companies that have ties with the CCP and that are working to develop Chinese tech companies that are going to be, global competitors to our companies. And so I think that the U.S. government, it's really incumbent on the U.S. government to kind of set the North Star and the ground rules, and to ask private industry, to basically outline the terms along which it wants to engage with private industry. I think the relationship should be collaborative. I don't think it should be abrasive, but I think that as long as private companies sense ambiguity, uncertainty, and a certain degree of vacillation from the policymaking community, I think they're going to try to basically skew the direction of the debate in favor of doing as little as possible, because at the end of the day, companies want predictability, they want stability, they like regulatory environments that don't change. And so, that's obviously good for business, and we want to have an environment that's good for business, but we also want to have an environment that, is good for democracy and the long-term viability of the country. And so I think that the US government should just really be clear about what the parameters are.
Yeah, no, I that's well taken. A challenge in this area, right, in technology, is that the technology changes fast, innovation occurs, unabated, and to me at least, that means that, or implies that the days of setting a rule, and think of the building code as an example, right? I mean, the building code is not, it changes, right, as technology changes, but by and large, I mean, buildings built 100 years ago right? Sort of the dawn of sort of modern, building safety, are pretty safe. And the code doesn't change that fast. But here, which allows builders and real estate developers, it gives them kind of certainty that businesses crave about what the regulatory environment looks like today and into the future. Tech is different though, right? It changes quicker. So how? I mean, there's it's an optimization problem, and I'm wondering, in your view, I mean, how woke is tech to this challenge, right? That yes, more stability is better, but that in this area there's going to be some limit to it, because government's going to have to adapt export controls, for example, to changing technology.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, what we're talking about is public and government parameters on that frame how American business can and can't do business with China. And during the Cold War, we had tremendous innovations in the US, and we did very little business with the Soviet Union. So I think that, that's not to say that we should go back to a model where we have no ties at all, but that is to say that there is a world where the US government issues guidelines and ground rules for how to do business with a country that is very adversarial to the US, without that necessarily being an impediment to American innovation.
So I want to turn now to some of the Q&A we're getting from attendees. Again, if you're an attendee and you have a question, don't be shy, drop it in the queue and we will do our best to get to your question. I want to start with a question from our colleague, Jim Dempsey. Jim, it's good to have you sitting in on our session today. Jim writes, Jacob, thanks for writing the book. Could you talk about the difference between efforts to keep Chinese tech out of US infrastructures, think telecoms, Huawei, for example, versus efforts to support development of US tech that would be as good as or better than Chinese-controlled tech, think AI? And how well is the US doing on each?
Well, we have a decentralized system. So, I mean, unlike China that kind of has, state-anointed tech champions, our system is full of curveballs. So, we didn't really have a competitor to 5G until, Starlink came about. I mean, Starlink isn't a 5G system. It's obviously a satellite-based system, but one of the beauties of the American system, where you have a free marketplace where entrepreneurs can pick things up and run with them, is every now and then you think that you're lagging behind, and then all of a sudden, a founder comes out of the woodwork and has this incredible innovation that, blasts the whole conversation forward 10x, at warp speed. And so I think that it's a little bit hard that, one of the features of having that kind of decentralization is that it's harder to track because it's not linear. It's not like, in China where you basically know who the big players are and you can kind of track linearly, the milestones that they're hitting. With that being said, there is no question that, China is truly very, 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 very formidable in the tech space. And, they obviously don't have any of the privacy constraints that we have, which gives them a lot, an extraordinary ability to collect a lot of data, which they can use to train a lot of their AI systems. So, I mean, that is a real advantage. But, they also have disadvantages, like the fact that we have a system that is much more comfortable with decentralized networks, i.e. blockchain technology or crypto. And, for them, decentralization is inherently threatening. So, they banned the crypto space. Ultimately, if blockchain technology ends up proving to be to produce, groundbreaking technologies, that's something that, their aversion to decentralization may actually end up leading them to miss, potentially big future innovations. So I think the picture is pretty mixed. I mean, they're making a lot of really impressive headways in AI, but, I wouldn't over-index the fact that because they operate and rely on a highly centralized system of political control, that one of the features of that system is that it's also more brittle. And so, we do have certain advantages in terms of, us being comfortable with decentralization.
Great, thank you. I'll add, I think, China certainly has several, advantages when it comes to, being able to skirt the rule of law. The government is not constrained vis-a-vis the private sector the way that the U.S. Government is. Although I also, want to be careful not to overstate that either. Part of the reason I think Xi has cracked down on, on parts of the tech ecosystem in China is precisely because of a concern that some of these companies and their executives have gotten too big for their britches. You look at Jack Ma and the IPO that was crushed at the 11th hour. That would never happen in the U.S. But on the other hand, I think that there is a level of selectivity that the Chinese government, engages in when it comes to supporting tech. So now, we see a lot of call it crackdowns on, call it sort of the digital economy, right? It's the ban on like internet or app-based tutoring recently. There was the caps on the amount of time that young people can spend on video games, crackdowns on a lot of content-related issues, whereas other parts, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Xi doesn't think that's the most productive use of Chinese citizen time and tech talent time. Whereas you look at semiconductors, telecommunications, it's a very different regulatory environment where we see these these multi decades long plans that do occasionally bear fruit. One question I have for you, Jacob, is just to maybe play a little bit of devil's advocate here on this debate about we see it particularly in some quarters of the U.S. political system about China as this kind of caricature of a all knowing, all seeing, well-tuned machine. You talk about the Constitution and how the vision in the book is sort of rooted in this vision for the U.S. government as defender, as having this national security responsibility. Why? And when we believe that capitalism, is a superior system for allocating resources. Democracy is both a functionally superior and a morally superior way, mechanism of governing. Why shouldn't we have the courage of our convictions when it comes to China? I mean, if
what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, look, if we are convinced that the American system, or at least an ideal type American system, right? Because we're always a work in progress. Is sort of the most effective, efficient mechanism for upholding human liberty and equality and all those important values. Why not let China fail? Right? If what are we missing? One of the questions, for example, in the chat is, and I can't tell if the question is facetious or not. It's, do you think China has democracy now? Interesting question.
I mean, first of all, I I think that the jury's out on, look, you look at Xi Jinping, and this is obviously a leader that has been at the head of a country that has, there's no question that they have achieved a lot of very impressive milestones, both in bringing people out of poverty and, making their kind of re-emerging their country on the global stage the way that they have. This is a guy that surrounds himself with masses of armed men, tanks, missiles, airplanes, and yet is terrified of a mouse of thought and words. And I mean, he punishes people at home. He threatens people abroad every time someone expresses themselves. And so if that is not a flawed system, you might look at abroad and look at China and be like, yeah, maybe they are more efficient than the democratic system in allocating resources and at making progress. But at the end of the day, here we are in this country having an open and free debate about these ideas, which is actually something that we wouldn't be able to do in China. Because in China, obviously, if you criticize, if you bring up Winnie the Pooh, that would probably qualify for you to get punished by the government. So I think that it's important to not lose sight about the fact that China showcases to the world a lot of stuff, GDP growth, military buildups. But at the end of the day, this is also a country where you have people that are getting detained arbitrarily, where you have, by some estimates, 3 million Uyghurs that are in re-education camps, 500,000 Tibetans that are in forced labor camps, and so, it's nobody ever said and claimed that America or democracy is perfect, but it's the capacity to self-correct and to introspect that is one of the great beauties of, of our raucous, messy system. It's the ability for us when there are excesses, and there always are, with Snowden, with flaws, injustices that continue to this day, that we have the ability to have open debates. You can talk about it in a free press, you can talk about it at a university. You can, if you think the government is doing something that's unlawful, you could take, that decision to an independent judiciary and actually have, they take the government to task and have it evaluated by independent judges. So we have a system of checks and balances, and that allows that system to adapt over time and self-correct, and it's not nearly as brittle as a more centralized, top-down system like you have in China. And I think that's why, fundamentally, we shouldn't take anything for granted, and it's going to be a very hard geopolitical contest. But at the end of the day, we should also be confident in the virtues of the system that we live in.
So another question from Jim Dempsey. What about efforts to remove Chinese-made products from U.S. infrastructure? Is that the right policy? A lot of the focus so far has been on telecoms. What other sectors should face similar efforts?
So a few years ago, I had a fascinating conversation with one of the chiefs of the Mossad. And I talk about this in the book, actually. And through one of those conversations, he basically was describing how when you own the physical internet infrastructure, you can have access and compromise everything that runs on top of that. You can extract the data, you can block the data, you can manipulate the data. And so I think that when you have a system like the Chinese government that blurs the line between public agencies and private companies, you have to prevent, in the United States, incorporating Chinese internet hardware into our physical internet infrastructure, because otherwise you could potentially be exposing yourselves to having a lot of backdoors in your infrastructure. And so I think that it is the right policy to prevent, to secure the integrity of our internet infrastructure. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that Congress has passed a number of bills that aim to do just that.
We've got about 7 minutes left. Still eager to hear questions from the audience. in the meantime, how do you see U.S. allies fitting into the equation here?
Well, interestingly, US allies have approached this issue a little bit differently between regions. The allies that have been the most supportive of a more hawkish stance on China have really been our Pacific allies. Those are the allies that are the closest to China and therefore are the closest to China's territorial disputes, to China's aggressive regional behavior. Our allies in Europe have been a little bit slow to come around. And part of that, I believe, is twofold. The first is economic interests. For example, Germany, the largest economy of Europe, exports billions of dollars worth of automobiles, BMW and Mercedes to China. And so that is a very strong economic incentive that often impedes Germany's desire to have a more hawkish stance on China. And then there's also just this desire to have what Europeans call strategic autonomy, which is, feeling like Europe is strategically, has an independent global strategic agenda that is independent of the United States. And a lot of European companies don't want to feel like they're America's junior partner. And that's a bit more psychological. It's not so much about dollars, but it's more about, the general feeling of wanting to feel independent. We saw that, play out with the fallout of the AUKUS deal, where obviously the AUKUS deal was signed. France was very upset, and the frustrations in France revived
the submarine sales, right?
The submarine sales to Australia, where the U.S. and the U.K. are collaboratively helping supply the Australians with nuclear-powered submarines. Part of why it's those countries working together is the UK actually has very sharp expertise in technical aspects of the development of nuclear subs, but also the US, the UK, and Australia are part of the Five Eyes network, and nuclear power subs are considered a crown jewel in terms of military secrets. But the optics were very bad in continental Europe because it seemed like this was an Anglo, the US playing favorites with its Anglo-Saxon partners. It did not play well in France at all. And so, but, dialing back to the initial point is that it really did revive a lot of the debate around strategic autonomy. And so I think that, strategic autonomy is ultimately something that American foreign policy makers are going to have to come to grips with our European partners to help them, convince them and persuade them that at the end of the day, their long-term interests are to see a world that is open, free, and friendly to democracy. And so while we may have some differences in interests here and there, from a high-level strategic standpoint, there is very little daylight in terms of the kind of world that we want to live in.
We have a question from Gustavo Ribeiro on kind of a similar theme, where there are a lot of countries in the world that are call them fence sitters, right? They're not in a political, economic position to push back too hard against. Let me put this slightly different way. They're cost sensitive. They may have, to Gustavo's point in the Q&A, they may have already made pretty substantial investments in Chinese telecommunications equipment. There are costs to changing it should the country decide it wants to move on or diversify its kit. So money is part of the equation, right? I mean, but beyond that financial aspect, What are the types of messages that you would advocate? So a U.S. policymaker to bring to regions, parts of the world who are facing a real dilemma. Do we, we could buy, the subsidized kit and give our citizens, access to the internet, which is a huge social and economic benefit, or potentially not because we can't afford equipment from elsewhere.
And I think, what you're pointing, you're putting your finger on a very important point, which is that at the same time, I'm of the view, which is a view that obviously reasonable people will disagree on, but I'm of the view that the US should discourage our allies to adopting Chinese technology in critical parts of their information infrastructure, and should encourage them to take similar steps as we've taken. But it's not going to be enough for us to have an anti-China agenda. We need to have a positive, affirmative view for, creating an allied commercial space that our countries can prosper in. We can't just tell our companies, don't do business in China. We need to tell them, don't do business in China, but here is, this other large market where you are able to prosper in, safely, in a way that is not, at odds with the national security of democracies, quote unquote. And so, with respect to tech infrastructure, I think that you're right. There have been proposals in the White House of really interesting ideas of, for example, just as an example, how do we come up with our alternative to Huawei's 5G network? And some of the ideas that were circulated in the White House a while back included, maybe we leverage the procurement power of the US government to spring up an American competitor. Maybe the US government buys an ownership stake in Nokia and Ericsson, which are obviously right now the most obvious alternatives to Huawei. And so having that kind of affirmative, positive agenda to articulate what we're for, in addition to what we're against, I think is really important, because people at the end of the day, being against something isn't enough. You have to be for something. And I think that, having the suite of solutions for what we're for is critical.
Right. Well, I'm looking at the time. We should wrap up. Any closing thoughts?
I think the main closing thought that I would stress is, in the foreign policy community, a lot of the times, I have found there's a lot of pessimism about, America's prospects in winning a geopolitical struggle with China, because China is such a big country. It's 1.4 billion people. And so the rationale often goes that, if Chinese citizens reach a level of GDP per capita and that is comparable to the level in the US, the size of their economy is going to be so large that there's no way that the US can compete long term. And the main point that I would emphasize that gives me optimism is the fact that I think that this geopolitical struggle is more than a competition between two countries. I think it's really a competition between ideas and systems of governance. And one of the and that is an area where the US has a built-in advantage. Our ideas are universal. China's, the ideas of democracy, universal human rights. China's ideas are much more sui generis. They're much more unique to China. Autocracy is not something that has universal appeal. And so I think that is something that should give us a lot of optimism, that at the end of the day, what we stand for is more than a country, it's more than a flag, but it's about an idea that America is simply a vehicle for, that a lot of people around the world aspire to, and we should feel very confident about what we stand for in this contest.
Well, thanks, Jacob. Great to have you join
Thanks
us for this
Thanks
webinar. It was a great book. To our attendees, thanks for your time this morning or afternoon or wherever you are in the world, brought to us by the power of Zoom. Have wonderful